guys, Nick Wisdom with HeliDirect to talk to you today about the basics of RC helicopter simulators. In our last episode in the beginner series, Jeff West and I talked about that your first helicopter should really be a simulator, right? So that you do all your initial practicing and learning your basic hover orientations in the computer and not in real life when a very expensive helicopter is at risk of crashing and breaking. You can literally save yourself thousands of dollars by purchasing a simulator. What's even better than that is they don't go away. Once you learn the basics of flight, you'll still use a simulator to prepare to learn the next maneuver. There's no point where you really outgrow a simulator. There's always something else, a new orientation, a new maneuver you want to just get the basic stick movements of before you try it in the real world with a real helicopter. So let's dig into it and cover some basics. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is purchase a simulator. So where do you go to do that? Obviously, you can get some here at HeliDirect. We sell the Next simulator as well as Accu RC, which works on the Steam platform. There's Real Flight Evolution is another great one, and HeliX is another popular simulator. So, to be honest, which one's better than the others? I like them all. Every simulator I've tried, I've been happy with. I think all of the modern simulators fly really well and certainly can help you learn your basics. I tend to gravitate towards Accu RC. It works both on a Mac as well as a PC. It also works in virtual reality if you've got a VR headset, which is another fun way to sim. But we're not going to get into the nitty-gritty. I really want to talk to you today about how you should practice and what you should be working on. Before we get too far into that, let's talk about your transmitter and how you connect to this thing. So, the cool thing is most modern transmitters have a USB connector on them that will connect to your computer, and the computer sees your transmitter as a joystick. It literally sees it no different than if you were able to connect like a PlayStation controller to it. So what I have here, and this is what I use as my primary sim transmitter, is the Radiomaster Zorro. It's a very small, super compact, super inexpensive transmitter. Why do I like that? Because I can put a ton of hours on this transmitter, and I'm not worried about wearing out the gimbals on my very expensive transmitters that I use for my larger helicopters. I also like that it's really tiny and portable, so I throw it in my briefcase. I do a lot of travel for work, so it's always there to get some little flights in on the laptop at the end of the day. Super small form factor, flies very well. What else is out there? This is a Spektrum transmitter. Here's the DX9. Spektrum transmitters generally connect via this little dongle here. This is the WS2000, and it's a little USB dongle. You just plug it into the side of the laptop. You actually bind your radio to this just like it was a receiver, and fly your heart out that way. Also have an FR Sky. This is the Tandem X20. This right here has a USB port just right on the top, and that's how you'd connect. The top is the same way, USB port on the back of the radio. And this, lastly, is my V-Control Touch from Mikado. This also has a USB port on the back, and you go ahead and connect. There are some simulators that will work with specific radios, such as HeliX working with the V-Control Touch as a wireless controller. So different simulators will work with different transmitters wirelessly, but they almost universally work with any transmitter via a wired USB connection. Okay, so that's the easy part, connecting the cable from the transmitter to the laptop. What happens after you do that? Let's take a look. When you first connect your radio via USB or whatever your method is to your simulator, the first thing you're going to have to do is some basic transmitter setup. Now, I'm going to start with Accu RC simulator here and just cover that. I'm not going to cover all the simulators, but they all follow a very similar process. So use the help menus, check YouTube videos, check the manufacturer's website. You'll find lots of great instruction on there. But generally you want to go to the transmitter interface or control interface and then take a look. So let's go ahead and take a look at that now. So as you can see here, this is one of the screens on Accu RC, and I'm actually going to move my throttle and collective pitch stick, which is mapped to the left stick up and down, and you can see that it feeds there. So I can actually go into these menus here on this pull down box and individually assign these functions. So you can see for the aileron, I'm going to move my aileron stick. It's obviously already mapped correctly, but if I pull this down, I could set this to a different axis. Now, if you look here on the right where it says all these axes, as I move the aileron stick, I can see like, oh, hey, look, axis 1 is what's moving here on this right-hand screen over here as I move my aileron stick, and then I'll come over here to aileron and assign axis 1. So this process of going back and forth and assigning functions and figuring it out, and you can also then do this via switches for changing RPMs or maybe resetting your simulator after a crash. You can actually map to some of the switches on the transmitter. But these setup screens is where you will go to assign these functions from your radio to the simulator. So now that we've gone ahead and get that done, we can go ahead and open the simulator and check it out. Okay, now that we've gone ahead and mapped our functions to everything we need in the simulator, the next thing you want to go ahead and do is create a new model in your radio. Why do we do that? Well, because we want a clean model that has no expo on any of the channels. It doesn't have any mixing in it. It's just straight output functions. So, channel 1, full throw, all directions, no expo, no dual rates, nothing altered like that. So we're going to do any of those functions like that in the simulator itself. So we've got a clean model that we're going to use to work with the sim. All right. Now that we've kind of doing that, let's go ahead and pick which model and which airfield we're going to fly in the simulator and start there. I'm going to go back to Accu RC here, and this is one of the screens you'll see from boot up. As you can see, we can just jump straight to flying. There's some different modes in here, but we're going to head towards the airplane hangar here, the models section. So as you can see, there's kind of a nice selection of aircraft here. What we're looking for is a 700 size helicopter, meaning the biggest size helicopter we can find in the simulator. Now, I know it's really tempting to look at these things here and say, well, I have a Goblin Kraken 580, I want to fly that in the sim. And while there's nothing wrong with that, the larger the model you fly in the sim, the easier it's going to be to see, and therefore the more effective you're going to have. For example, if you have a Blade 230S, that might be in the simulator, but it's a fairly small helicopter. Flying out in the sim gets really tiny on a laptop screen really quickly. So pick a larger helicopter. They're all going to respond similarly in the real world. What you learn on a 700 size helicopter in the sim will apply to your OMP, M2, Blue Sky, S2, any helicopter on the market. They're all going to respond similarly to an extent. So for the purpose of beginner basics, pick the largest helicopter. It's also not going to be quite as twitchy in the simulator, so it'll give you a little more reaction time, a little more time to learn how to make corrections, which is what we're after here in the simulator. So I'm going to go ahead and choose the Goblin Raw 700 here. Okay, the next thing we're going to do is pick where we fly. So every simulator will call it something different, usually scenery or airfields or flying fields. So we're going to go ahead and click on scenery here. And what we want is something that's not too busy, so it doesn't have a crazy background. And ideally, if there's a runway or something with lines on it that helps us, figure out where the helicopter is over a specific point, that works really well. So I'm going to go ahead and pick the Urcha Center Stage in Accu RC. Okay, we've got our field selected, so the first thing we want to do is just basically test our functions and make sure they work. So if you look in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, I'll make it a little bigger here for you, you can see these two boxes. So that's my left stick, and that's my right stick moving right now, which is my cyclic stick, collective stick over here, rudder right here. So let me go ahead and get them all a little spooled up. There it goes. I'm going to give just a little bit of rudder. That's left stick to the left. The nose should go left like that. That works. I'm going to go back to center by moving it to the right. Okay. I'm going to move that stick to the right. Nose moves to the right. That's working. So I'm doing all this at what we would call neutral pitch. So see how the stick is kind of centered? Now I'm going to give just a little bit of positive pitch. It should start to lift off. And it's getting light on the skids, and there it goes. I'm going to set it right back down with negative pitch. So we know that works. Okay. So now we're going to check our right stick or our cyclic stick. We're going to give it some forward elevator, and the nose of the helicopter should lean down. So I can actually rotate it to the right a little so you can see. And then I'm going to just lean a little. Yep, that leaned. That works. I'm going to pull it back. The tail should drop. Pull it back. Tail comes down a little bit. Okay. Now, last thing to check is our aileron direction. So I'm going to give a little bit of left movement on the right stick, and the helicopter should move to the left just a little. There it goes. And now I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to move it to the right just a little bit. And there it goes. Okay. So now our controls are mapped correctly. All right. So we're good to go. Let's go fly, right? It's time to learn how to hover. So while that's spooling down, let's talk about some basic strategies here. So the first thing we're going to work on is a tail in hover. We're just going to lift the model up. We're going to feel what those controls are like, what happens when I move the sticks, how fast do I move them, all of those things, and then see what happens. We're just working on learning what the controls do, and then eventually we're going to start working on corrections and getting the helicopter in a stable hover. All right, I'm going to switch sims to the next sim so you can see what that looks like, and it's got a couple of layouts I like. So I'm going to go ahead and do that now, and then we'll come back. Okay, so here is the next flight simulator. Now, one of the things I like here is there's an F3C layout you can turn on in the settings to give you this nice little circle on the ground, which just helps give you a reference for where you're hovering. Now you can see in this one, the sticks are shown by these sticks. That's my right stick moving around there on the center at the bottom of your screen. So first thing we're going to do is pull the helicopter up to a stable tail in hover. So let's go ahead, make that a little bigger, and go ahead and lift off. Okay. So I'm going to kind of fly like I imagine a beginner would, so a little herky-jerky. Initially your movements are going to be kind of large, the helicopter is going to feel a little wild. Don't freak out, that's normal. What it takes is a lot of practice to learn that what works are stable control movements, okay? So this little laser line coming down from the helicopter is just to sort of help you hover it over a specific point. But we're just going to practice a stable tail in hover, and we're just going to keep it inside this circle here. And you're going to fly a lot like this, and this is okay. What you're doing is just learning corrections. You're learning this is what happens when I move the rudder. You're learning that when I give a right aileron input, it just keeps going right until I correct back to the left. All right, and every time, same thing. If I pull it stick back to me, the helicopter is going to get closer and closer to me until I lean forward. So for every action you input, you then need to counter it. And what you learn is that these very small corrections, moving a helicopter around, can get you a very stable hover. So all I'm aiming to do, and don't focus too much on that laser beam, is just stay between these 3 hash marks here on the ground. And I'm just going to keep making corrections until we do. And that's step 1. Before you ever lift a real helicopter into the air, you need to be able to do this. So keep the helicopter in a stable hover over a fixed point on the ground. And I do here what I recommend you all do is I actually have wind speed turned up here in the simulator to something like 5 to 10 miles an hour. And that way the helicopter will never really sit still. And you know, theoretically in a perfect zero wind day or in a perfect sim environment, the helicopter is going to kind of stay put when you let go of the sticks. But you don't want that. You want the wind always moving, the environment working against you, because that's more what it's like to fly in the real world. Okay, so now we've got our tail in hover master, right? So we can keep the helicopter pointed at ourselves. Now it's a matter of learning the next orientation, which is to rotate the nose to the right so that the tail is pointing towards the left. So I'm going to go ahead and show you that now. Okay, so we're going to lift up, get ourselves into our stable hover somewhere over the circle, and then we're going to slowly rotate the tail, and it's going to feel like this. It's going to move funny, and it's going to look funny. Now we're getting used to looking at the helicopter in a whole new light. And you're learning that your corrections are all rotated 90 degrees now. So although they all do the same thing from the helicopter's perspective, from your perspective of the pilot, they get awfully confusing awfully quickly. And this skill takes a while to master. And those of us who've been flying for some time will actually go back and practice these from time to time. Maybe we're not having a great day at the field, we're feeling a little off as far as practicing advanced stuff, so we'll spend some time investing on the basics. So again, I've got a lot of wind turned on here, but we're just practicing hovering with the nose of the helicopter pointing towards the right. And then what's next? So your first 2 orientations are tail towards you and tail left. And let me show you a little trick. What you can do when you're first learning is actually rotate the tail. So here's your tail in. And rotate the tail 45 degrees. So it's not quite so intimidating because the controls essentially do the same, but you're getting used to looking at the side of the helicopter, right? Now, when you do this in the real world for the first time, the helicopter is going to be much higher, but I'm keeping it here for purposes of the video. All right, so now we get used to our 45, we're going to go ahead and go nose right, and just get used to that. Get used to the corrections, keeping it in the right spot. And when you get confused in both the real world and the sim, take yourself back to a known orientation. So we're always going to go back to tail in. And you'll find you'll do this a lot as you're learning new skills. You'll figure out what orientations are comfortable to you. And an orientation is just which way the helicopter is facing, upright, inverted, and which way it's pointed. And then when you get nervous, you just go back to that. So if I start getting out of control here with tail this way, I'm going, whoop, back, settle the helicopter, tail in, I'm comfy. Spent a lot of time practicing this. And then now I'm going to go ahead and go back to working on this one. All right, so now we're going to go, our third orientation is just going to be nose pointed to the left. So go ahead and just start practicing that. And again, just trying to keep it over the circle. And you want to learn in all these orientations what the rudder does, what all of the controls do in terms of correcting it. And it's very important that you get used to rotating in both directions. So rotating this way, rotating that way. So for every skill you learn on a helicopter, make sure you're learning the rudder in both directions so that you know what it does. So when you're doing your nose orientation this way, think about like, okay, I want the nose to point towards me. Which way would the rudder go? It goes this way. So make sure you're able to do that. Now we've mastered our orientation, nose left and nose right. And you can now, we don't even need tail in anymore. We can go between those two and just work on those. And when we get nervous, we go tail in. We relax, we recover the helicopter with small movements. You don't want to start recovering with these huge, this is how you crash, doing, big movements like that. But no big deal. In the simulator, helicopter's just going to restart and pick up where we left off. Okay, so now that we've got our side orientations, let's go ahead and look at nose in. So let's get in one of our side orientations. And then we're going to use the same trick here. We're going to go to kind of 45 degrees, just slowly, and then it's not quite so intimidating. So we're still kind of like side in, noticing the corrections are a little bit different, but no big deal. Okay, we're getting the hang of this. I'm going to go a little more. I'm just moving the rudder there to get the nose kind of pointed towards me slowly. And as I get more and more comfy, we'll go full on. And then I'm going to go all the way now. So this is one of the trickier orientations to learn because everything is reversed at this point from your perspective. Again, the controls are still the same to the helicopter. It's just everything's a little off. And there's some tricks you can learn to these. For example, if you push the stick up, helicopter's going to come towards you. You pull it back, and it will drift away from you. And then there's an expression the airplane guys use in the radio control world. When the airplane's flying towards you, you push the stick under the low wing to level it. It's the same thing with a helicopter, right? If I start a drift to this side, if I move my stick to that side of the rotor disc that was lower, it'll level it out. And again, small corrections here. Even when it drifts far away from you there, small corrections until you have it under control, nose in towards you. I'm just going to trying to keep this thing inside this small circle here. So as you can see, nose in, at least in the sim, is not that intimidating. The more you practice it in the sim, the less intimidating it is in the real world. Okay, so what can we work on next in the simulator to improve our skills now that we've got those 4 basic orientations? Okay, so I'm going to show you a trick that someone showed me that I thought was really helpful. So I'm going to take my rudder trim, which is usually the little nib under the stick or maybe to one side that would adjust the center point of where your rudder is, and I'm going to keep putting a bunch of clicks of trim in until the helicopter starts rotating on its own. So I'm hands off here. So I'm hands off. The helicopter is oh so slowly rotating on its own because I've offset the trim to a point where you don't want to leave it there. You really want it at center. But what I want to create here is the helicopter to slowly rotate on its own. And I'm going to show you why when I go ahead and lift off. I'm going to wait though for the helicopter to be pointing tail towards me, which is my comfortable orientation. And then once it gets facing towards me, I'm going to go ahead and lift off. And I'm not really going to use my rudder here much, but what I'm trying to do is let the helicopter rotate slowly and keep it over the circle. So this is going to take some doing because it's confusing. The helicopter's rotating. You're used to sort of doing, static orientations, and now you've got the helicopter kind of spinning. And we'll do this with real helicopters too, only we input the stick ourselves. It's called a slow piro or slow pirouette. That's what we call it when the helicopter rotates. So doing this and trying to keep it over the circle, and you want to do this in both directions. So move the trim in one direction and then move the trim in the other direction. And then just work on trying to keep it over that circle. When it gets too close, let it drift back, like that. It's not so easy. But doing this and mastering this skill means that any way the helicopter's facing, when you can do this both upright and inverted, means that you'll be a champ. You're used to seeing it in all these angles, and you didn't have any trouble at all. And it's okay if you drift around like this. I'm trying to recreate sort of what the experience might be like for you. You're not going to perfectly be over the center of that circle ever. But the point is, be able to recover from those moments, even when you have some herky-jerky corrections like I just did there for you, right? See? Oh, backing around. And I'm trying not to input rudder, but if you need to, use that rudder to get that tail pointed back towards you. All right? I'm just trying to master this slow piro skill to the point where I can do very small corrections and really keep it over a very small area. And again, for every correction you do, eventually you're going to have to correct opposite it because the helicopter is going to start drifting in that direction. Okay, and that's the slow piro. Okay, so a guy named Matt Bodos, a very famous helicopter pilot in the RC hobby, used to call these boreentations or boring orientations and emphasize that practicing these makes you a better pilot. And he's right. But that doesn't mean that all of what you do in the sim initially has to be boring. It is totally okay to structure your time. And here's what I suggest. Right? Initially, when you're just working on tail and hovers, that's all you're going to do. Right? But for every sim session, make sure you work on practicing something, a skill for 1 minute, 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. Every person's different into how much they can take and focus all of their energy into it. And then let yourself have some playtime, right? Like it's totally okay to be in the sim and have fun, right? So if you're working on orientations and you want to see what it's like to flip the helicopter inverted, like you can do that. That's okay, right? Like just flip the sticks around and see what happens, right? Like that's all right. And you'll crash and you'll fly up behind you and you'll break all the rules, but it's okay to throw the helicopter around and see what happens, okay? And just get used to seeing it in different ways. Although that's not, super effective way to learn, you have to let yourself have some fun in the simulator, right? If you're just doing boring, 4-point orientations like this, it just doesn't get that exciting after a while. So do let yourself have some playtime, take off, like I said, and see what you like. Try an inverted orientation. See if that's terrifying, or if, get used to seeing how that is, and then it'll blow your mind, and then you go, oh boy, here's what I really have to work on. And get back to your uprights. So when you're working on your orientations, don't be afraid to have a little fun. Do some free-form practice. It doesn't have to all be boring, over the circle kind of stuff. Now, let's talk for a minute just about what some of the other simulators have to offer. A lot of the sims have built-in training tools, so you can go ahead and look through their help screens and menus for that. There's usually a hover training where there's a circle. When you fly outside of it, it resets your helicopter. Real Flight has a nice one of those. There's different modes in all these simulators, so do check out what training is built in. Some of these simulators, you can actually turn off some functions. So if you want to turn off your collective pitch so the helicopter stays at a fixed altitude off the ground and just focus on what the right stick does and the rudder does, you can do that. You can deactivate some functions so you get used to the others and then turn it back on and then put all those pieces back together. So there's a few different ways to structure your initial practice. Okay, so the question I know you're wondering is, at what point can I move to the real thing? So I know some of you might be thinking, because let's face it, we're all excited to fly the real thing. As soon as I can hover a helicopter, and I'm going to use this little XK110 here, tail in towards me, I can go ahead and hover the real thing. But the fact is that something will happen, the environment will change, and the helicopter is going to rotate a little bit, and you didn't practice your side-in orientations yet, so you're not equipped to know how to bring this, what direction do I move the rudder to bring the tail back towards me. So it's really important you learn your 4 basic orientations so that no matter what happens to the helicopter, you know how to hover it, right? You can always bring yourself to your comfortable position, which is typically tail in towards you. For some folks, it's, nose right is their most comfortable position, and that's fine. There's nothing that dictates which has to be your most comfy, but you'll quickly figure out you're better at one of the 4, and that's the orientation you will always rotate the helicopter to when you get out of trouble. When things are going funny and you're confused, you're going to level and bring it back to you. It's getting weird. Level and bring it back to you. So once you have those 4 orientations done, there's no reason you can't then go ahead and practice those hovers. And once you have those hovers down, there's the slow pirouette you can work on. And then from there, you can start drawing shapes in the hover. So you take the helicopter and you're going to hover it in a box. So you start at a fixed position on a corner. And if you have some cones, that makes this even better. You can get those short little cones from sporting goods stores. So go from cone to cone in a square. So hover over one cone, drift to the other, stop, stable, hover. Move to the next cone, stop, stable, hover. Next cone, stop, stable, hover. And then back to the first cone. And then when that starts getting easy, do it in a new orientation. So side on, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then when you're feeling really strong, you're going to do it nose in. You're going to go nose in, 1, 2, 3, 4. And those skills are really going to build a massive layer of fundamentals under your flying that are radically going to improve it. I hope this gives you some confidence and some ideas as to how to go from purchasing your first helicopter to actually really enjoying your flight. It can get really frustrating if you just jump into flying too soon and crash and crash and crash and are paying for repair after repair after repair. And we lose a lot of people from the hobby who get impatient like that. So put the time in the simulator. It pays off, and down the road, I promise you. All right, with that, I'm Nick Wisdom. You're watching Hack TV. This has been another episode in our beginner series. We hope this helps. Any questions, comments, go ahead and drop them below. Thanks very much.